Did you ever wonder as you step onto the sidewalk if there might be another New York City right below? Not subways or sewers, but maybe something new.
The way that we want to light it is to actually suck light from the surface and basically treat light like a liquid and channel it down here.
It's really can be an incredible life changer for people in New York City.
Did you realize there's a tunnel from Westchester that travels all the way to the middle of Manhattan? No power, no electricity, no nothing. This was the secret tunnel to the city.
Sure, and it still is.
And right under the Gatehouse in Central Park is a world that reservoir joggers never see.
There are places where the old and the new do cross. You'll see piping that comes out of here that is original. It's back to the 1860s.
Come with me to a place that's closer than you think, just below the city we know, where we can find some of the underground secrets of New York. Manhattan ran out of room decades ago. Before you can build something new on this island, you have to tear down something old. Unless you take something old and turn it into something completely different, like New York's High Line. It's a 1930s railroad that's now an incredibly popular city park. Before it was completed, a park on an elevated railbed sounded pretty strange, but not as strange as an underground park, which is why James Ramsey is calling his idea the Low Line.
New York is a very crowded place, right? And it's not every day that you just find an acre of square footage. And so the idea that we could actually look to places that are even underground for public space or whatever is one that I think is particularly resonant with a crowded place like New York.
Ramsey found his hidden acre of real estate as he was running an architectural firm in Manhattan.
I met this old MTA engineer who told me about these amazing lost spaces underneath New York City, and there's tons of them. And the one that I found most interesting was actually the Williamsburg Trolley Terminal.
You can see the old trolley terminal from the Essex Street stop on the J Line. It looks dim and mysterious, fading off into the darkness. But the only way to really check out the potential of the Low Line is to go below, down the familiar subway steps, through the corridors, and into a space that's been closed for 65 years. Embedded in the floor are tracks where the last trolleys rolled out across the Williamsburg Bridge to Brooklyn in 1948.
When you see the tracks today, they are in the same location they were when the terminal was in operation. They haven't been changed. It's a one-way loop operation, sort of a giant U-turn.
Overhead, covered by layers of dust, are old wooden guides where the trolley cars got their power.
What you see is a guideway for the overhead power line that powered the trolleys. The word trolley actually refers to the metal pole that connects the car to an overhead wire that provides power for the car. The reason why there's a guideway there is because in case the pole came off the wire because of the curve, you wouldn't create a short circuit.
When this underground terminal opened to the public, Teddy Roosevelt was in the White House, and people lined up to pay a nickel for the fare to Brooklyn.
It's the largest existing site that we know of the former streetcar era anywhere in New York City, where you actually have existing cobblestones and rail lines and these crosshatches and these columns and these incredible ceilings. So there's this amazing historic side that I think a lot of New Yorkers really are looking to explore.
But how do you grow trees on a subway platform? It helps that Ramsey used to be a satellite engineer for NASA.
I started fiddling around with this general idea that you could maybe start to treat light like a liquid and actually channel it around to places where you might not otherwise imagine natural sunlight could go.
Engineer Ed Jacobs built a device to transfer sunlight based on Ramsey's design. It's a scale model of the big dishes that will collect natural light for the Low Line.
Basically, there's a large parabola here, and then on the internal side of this aluminum piece, there's a second parabola. And so the light basically is bounced off one, bounced off another, and it's all calculated to be directed directly at the fiber optic.
The cable.
Yeah.
Imagine a hose that you would fill with water, right? We're concentrating sunlight into a super concentrated bead and feeding it into that hose. And so it travels along that hose and it goes underground where we can then just spread it back out to just simulate the conditions above ground.
Could this actually work? We left the collecting dish outside and fed the cable into a dark room. The sunlight followed us right through the flexible tube.
With this quality of fiber and this type of sheathing, we get an incredible amount of light transfer. And this can extend to whatever lengths you want, depending on the quality of cord you get.
It can really go far distances, right?
Incredibly far, farther than what we would actually need to create the whole low-lying project.
So how does this plug in so that we can see the light?
Yeah, it plugs in just like this. It's a secondary reflector.
This reflects a lot of light.
Yeah, it can be an incredible life changer for people in New York City.
So Ed, could we light all of the low line in huge entire spaces with this concept?
Absolutely. I mean, with what's going on in New York with rooftop gardens and all this, imagine this complete subterranean gardens being produced as well. A layer of green above, a layer of green now below. Totally plausible and possible.
The 30-foot dishes planned for the ceiling of the old trolley station will spread enough light to grow plants and trees. Just getting into an abandoned subway space will fascinate a lot of New Yorkers.
The low line is a great idea. People have been passing it on the subways every day for 65 years and wondering, gee, what is this big open space? And they want to find out more about it.
I think we're all really enchanted by the space. I think the rawness of it is part of the charm right now. But I think we're also thinking about the fact that this space has sat down here vacant for so long.
I think the final design will be creating the most quintessential possible New York City park, one in which people inside a park can actually see the subway flashing by in some way, and people on the subway can flash by and see an incredible public space.
Is this something that is going to be a hard sell for New Yorkers, this space?
You know, it's interesting. You know, you talk to people in New York and you get one of two responses. Some people say, this is the most exciting science fiction idea I've ever heard in my entire life. And other people say it'll never work. But it's important to remember, I think, that there were a lot of people who did not think that the High Line was in any way an interesting thing. It's hard sometimes, I think, to imagine what a space could become.
It's hard to imagine unless you're a former NASA scientist who's used to making science fiction into reality.
I mean, it's definitely from a different planet. When I actually first set foot in this space, I felt like Indiana Jones or something, discovering some giant chamber in here. So it really very much felt like this undiscovered sort of archaeological cavern discovery kind of thing.
In your ideal dream, what are we looking at here? Where will we be standing right here, right now?
Right about now, we are still in this sort of main open plaza area. So an area for people to actually sit down, grab a bite of food, have a drink, etc.
So potentially restaurants, potentially a performance space, a hub of activity, the subway over there.
It will be an experience that is completely unlike anyone has ever experienced before. Basically, what we're trying to do is to use this almost sort of futuristic technology, almost like a time machine, to sort of go reach into our distant past, like 100 years ago, and sort of pull that history back into the present.
Truly a secret that New Yorkers really don't yet know about.
Not yet.
The secret spaces underneath our feet are part of the infrastructure that keep the city alive. But far older are the tunnels that first carried water into New York. They were built back when the city stopped at 14th Street and people were running out of drinking water. When New York finally committed to bringing clean water into the city, they could have chosen the Bronx, even New Jersey. But they decided to build a dam here at the Croton River and transport the water 40 miles into Manhattan.
If you think of what happens to a city if it has no water for 3 days, 5 days, 2 weeks, you can't fight fires, manufacturing ends, people don't have water for cooking, for washing. You know, it very quickly is reduced to a primitive place.
Water pipes from the late 1700s were sometimes made from hollowed-out tree trunks, which didn't last long. Ground wells became contaminated with raw sewage, spreading diseases like cholera. After the Great Fire of 1835 gutted most of southeast Manhattan, the search was on to find a reliable water supply.
They ultimately chose the Croton River, even though it was far away, because it had such a bounty of water and the water quality was good.
The problem was that the Croton River is far to the north in Westchester. Tapping it required a water tunnel more than 40 miles long into Manhattan. It was built in an era when Americans were still using whale oil and candles to light their homes. A lot of people thought the aqueduct could never be built.
So how great of an engineering feat was this in the 1830s?
For that time, it was really on the level of what a space mission would be today.
Wow.
And the people of New York regarded the engineers of the Croton Aqueduct Department really with the kind of reverence that we have now for astronauts and people like that. It was a very special thing.
Special because the aqueduct was fed entirely by gravity. It had to drop exactly 13 inches for every mile it traveled to keep the water flowing into Manhattan. If it came to a hill, they bored through the rock. If it came to a valley, they built a bridge. Whatever was necessary to keep the tunnel on a slow descent to the city. Sometimes the aqueduct lay on top of the ground, covered by earth and the Westchester forest.
So where are we walking right now?
Well, we're actually on top of the protective mound. It looks like just a little path.
Right here.
Yes, but underneath us is this huge aqueduct tunnel. All this land was built up artificially to accommodate the aqueduct. So not only did the engineers and the workmen have to build the aqueduct tunnel, but they had to make this big encasing for it. Not only did it protect it, but it allowed the smooth flow of water from the Croton Dam right down to 42nd Street. It is such an amazing feat. We talk about it as the engineering marvel of the 19th century.
Chief Engineer John Jervis directed thousands of Irish immigrants to build the old Croton Aqueduct in just 5 years.
This was Irish farmers who escaped the potato famine and were working here to create this mound that we're walking on and the tunnel inside.
Every few miles, they channeled the water into something called a weir chamber, which could divert the flow in case of repairs.
So Bob, what is a weir?
It's one of those structures along the aqueduct that controls the flow of water. This is a gear that raises and lowers a big gate valve.
Let me try this. So this would be turned a certain way to close and open it.
Right. So with this valve, you could actually cut off the water supply to New York City.
Where is the aqueduct?
The aqueduct is right below here, and we can go down by this stair.
The cast iron stairway leads down to a section of the aqueduct where workers used to enter to do repairs. The tunnel is pitch black, and parts of it are dead ends that don't have enough air to breathe. People sneaking into the aqueduct can lose their lives. But before we could explore it, I had to get safety training from Park Ranger Gary Ricci and his rescue team. So what are we looking at?
Yeah, these are rescue bottles. They have air in them. If somebody doesn't have a mask such as you and there's an emergency where there's bad air, it would give us about a half an hour to get you out of that space.
I see.
Besides the safety harness and hard hat, we also had waders to keep out the groundwater at the bottom of the aqueduct. When safety training was over, Gary and I found ourselves in a tunnel cut through solid rock. The first thing that struck me were the thousands of red bricks, still perfectly set 175 years after they were put in place.
Considering how old it is, it looks to be very stable and you know, I don't see many cracks or anything, of course, even though it's not being used.
It's one of the most impressive things about this. The engineer used a special kind of hydraulic mortar, relatively new at the time. Typically, for the most part, the aqueduct has the arched roof, the arched ceiling. So when the aqueduct was built underneath, when it was tunneled through rock, where the surface ground was higher than the aqueduct, they tunneled. It wasn't important to build the arched roof. They just left the natural stone above.
I see. And this stone is what?
It's just bedrock.
You can still see marks where the bedrock was blasted with black powder. dynamite hadn't been invented yet.
I'm surprised we haven't seen any crickets yet.
Crickets?
Yes.
I'm running. There are a lot of crickets down here. What else are down here? Alligators?
Some alligators,
Eels?
perhaps, maybe, you never know. Bats on occasion.
I see a water snake.
I don't know too much about the history of this gate here. I'm assuming this was put in to prevent the stray straggler from going too far into the aqueduct. As you can see, we go back into a tunneled section before we get to the regular
And
aqueduct.
up ahead is the tunnel that curves to the right.
Yes,
Many more miles of aqueduct.
many more.
Okay. Oh, wow.
To you.
So, Gary, this is north we're looking at.
Yes, we're looking upstream toward the dam.
So if we kept going through this tunnel and followed it up, what would we run into?
Eventually, we'd run into a plug on the other side of Ossining. Beyond that, the aqueduct is active. It's currently feeding the village of Ossining with some of its drinking water.
40 miles of a brick lifeline to Manhattan, all put into place 20 years before America fought the Civil War.
And all that fed this aqueduct, the water that came down into it to the city, was all fed from gravity. That's
Yes.
it. No power, no electricity, no nothing. This was the secret tunnel to the city.
Sure. And it still is.
More than 40 miles later, the Croton Water reached its first stop in Manhattan, a reservoir where Central Park's Great Lawn is today. It was soon replaced by an even bigger body of water, the only reservoir left in Manhattan. Right along its edge, there's a secret on the pathway thousands of joggers pass every day, called the South Gatehouse.
This gatehouse is part of the second reservoir that was built with the original Croton Aqueduct system. This was built in 1859. The original reservoir was built about a decade before in what's now the Great Lawn. And the water would flow out of here and down to a distribution reservoir where the 42nd Street Library is now.
So what was the need for the second reservoir?
Well, as the population of the city grew from just shy of 100,000 people to over 300,000 people, they recognized that the supply, the storage just wasn't adequate. And so the original reservoir had a capacity of roughly 150 million gallons. This reservoir is 10 times that.
Northern Manhattan expanded around the water supply the aqueduct provided. Blocks of houses appeared with new indoor plumbing, ready to tie into the Croton Water. And this was one of its first control centers.
Under the gatehouse, you'll see some of the piping that actually took the water out of the reservoir and carried it down to 42nd Street. The original old Croton Aqueduct was a brick structure very akin to the old aqueducts of Rome. And so that technology was very consistent with that. Down below here, you'll see, large pipes, 48-inch diameter cast iron pipes. That is original. I mean, it's back to the 1860s.
Deep underneath Central Park, with a wall of water pressing on one side, a cavern filled with Victorian technology controlled the drinking water for 19th century Manhattan. Before the age of electric motors, hand wheels opened and closed the flow of fresh river water that had traveled all the way from Westchester to different neighborhoods in the city. Huge iron risers still hold the pressure of millions of gallons, even though this reservoir is no longer used for drinking water. New York is one of the few great cities whose water is fed almost entirely by gravity. And this was mission control for one of the greatest feats of early American engineering.
Our forefathers were brilliant engineers, and they did a remarkable job building something that will be closing in on 200 years soon enough.
From Central Park, the flow traveled south to the place where Croton Water was actually delivered to the city. In the 1840s, the distributing reservoir was located at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. Murray Hill is where they built the New York Public Library in 1902, the largest marble structure in America at the time. Tom Lennon works here as assistant curator of manuscripts, where you can find many secrets of New York. The biggest one is that the whole library sits on top of the last stop for the old Croton Aqueduct.
This was the site of the distributing reservoir. We're looking at a map from 1844, which shows the Croton Aqueduct coming down over the Harlem River, through Manhattanville, through Bloomingdale Square, and then finally ending at Murray's Hill.
And that was the highest point of the city at the time?
Indeed, it was the highest point. It was about 119 feet above sea level. The reservoir had 20 million gallons of water and distributed water by a series of pipes down to the city below.
And so at the time, was it something that people looked in awe of?
Absolutely. It was the biggest structure of its kind in the middle of the city.
Would you say it was comparable to like the Empire State Building today? Was it that sort of fame at the time?
It's a lot like the Empire State Building because it was a destination for people to actually walk around and see and take in the view. Edgar Allan Poe wrote that those visiting the city should take the time to walk up to 42nd Street and see the view from the top of the reservoir.
People walked on a wide promenade built on top of a massive square building created in the Egyptian style. It stood 45 feet high with 2 stone pools inside to store the water. And since there were no other tall buildings near 42nd Street, you could see both rivers and all the way south to the Battery. On holidays, the place was important enough to decorate with flags.
In the 1830s, there was no such thing as indoor plumbing. Only we would say, the wealthiest of people could have water delivered to their house. At the library, we have 2 receipts for water. The first one is from the Manhattan Water Company from 1824. The second one is from the Croton Aqueduct Department from 1852. It's about 25 years difference, but the water price is actually halved. So the water got less expensive as a result of the Croton Aqueduct.
You can still see a piece of 1840s New York at the New York Public Library's Stephen A. Schwartzman building, if you know where to look. On a staircase from the main floor, giant granite blocks from the reservoir wall still catch the light. But there's another secret here almost nobody knows about.
In the basement of the library is a brick wall which is recessed like a pattern of steps. I think that brick wall could have been in place from the reservoir.
So what does it look like?
The stones of the recessed steps are huge and are different than the brick above. So these stones could have been in place since the reservoir was designed in the 1840s.
Covered by layers of white paint, you can see the big reservoir stones jutting out from the library wall, relics from another age. And under these granite blocks lie the pipes that allowed Manhattan to free itself from an outdated water supply to become a great metropolis. As New York City expanded north, our water supply had to grow with it. New water tunnels increased the flow from upstate, and areas like this one in the Bronx became sites for even bigger reservoirs.
How much space does it take to keep New York City from going thirsty? What do you need to handle droughts, fires, or peak demands when everyone wakes up and turns on their faucets?
Well, for starters, you need places that can hold 1 billion gallons of water. The Jerome Park Reservoir is empty at the moment, waiting for the filtration plant that will be the latest pathway for Croton water into the city. When the plant opens, distribution will be controlled from here, the new underground valve chamber built by the New York City's Department of Environmental Protection.
This facility will control the flow of water out of the plant into the city, much the same way the reservoir and the gatehouse did in the past.
How much water do New Yorkers use a day?
Well, overall, the city consumes about 1 to 1.1 billion gallons of water a day. This facility will manage up to 300 million gallons of that.
It sounds tremendous. If you were to quantify that just in terms of daily speak, what is 1 billion gallons of water?
1 billion gallons of water is 96 acres of space that's 20 to 30 foot deep. You know, it's a large lake that covers an enormous area, and yet it's really just one day's consumption for us.
This distribution center required moving 13,000 cubic yards of soil and 3,000 yards of solid rock to create a new way to send Croton water into the city's neighborhoods. Clean water is as important today as it was back in 1842.
At the old aqueduct, we saw sort of big valves and things that looked like hand churns. Don't really see that here. Does it work the same way, though?
Here we have more modern equipment that's powered by electric motors and different types of valves, but they serve the same basic functions. The engineers that did all the planning and the 6,000 employees that work for the agency, it's a testament to a long tradition that, you know, we're just stewards of, and, you know, we will pass the baton on as we go.
Next time you wander the streets, remember the rivers that flow beneath the pavement, built into tunnels 175 years ago. Everywhere you move, there are secrets of an older city under your feet. All you have to do is look for them.
The Roaring 20s for nothing. Alcohol was illegal, so who would you turn to if you really wanted to drink?